and today I would like to present a detailed overview of a book. That book contains a story of the knowledge, rather map of the knowledge, because uh, the learned author has depicted the knowledge through the geographical locations and people. So this is very much interested book, and this book is map of the knowledge. Very worth to be read. Map of the knowledge, written by Violet Moeller. Violet Moeller's this book is a work of intellectual, cultural, and scientific history, published in 2019. The book traces the transmission of ancient Greek scientific knowledge across roughly millennium, from late antiquity to Renaissance. Its central narrative follows three bodies of knowledge associated with Euclid, Ptolemy, and Galen through seven major intellectual centers: Alexandria, Baghdad, Cordoba, Toledo, Salerno, Palermo, and Venus. So these are the cities and three people and seven major intellectual centers. Moeller's fundamental achievement is to transform what could have been a technical history of manuscripts into a compelling story about how human knowledge survives, how human knowledge travels, how human knowledge changes and becomes part of civilizations other than the one in which it originated. So knowledge has also flow, and it flows throughout the world, throughout the globe, and it remains also at other civilizations too. The central idea of the book, the central question of the book is deceptively simple. How did the scientific and intellectual achievement of the ancient world survive to influence the Renaissance and the modern world? Moeller answers this by following the journey of intellectual tradition of Euclid, mathematics and geometry, especially the elements; Ptolemy, astronomy, especially the Almagest; Galen, medicine and medical theory. The original work did not travel directly from ancient Greece to Renaissance Europe. Instead, they passed through a complicated chain of copying, then preservation, then translation, then commentary, and then correction, and then adaptation, then retransmission, and then printing. So that is a good chain through which the knowledge has been transferred and transformed. This is the conceptual heart of the book. Moeller therefore changes our understanding of the survival of the knowledge. Knowledge does not simply survive by being stored in libraries. It survives because human beings actively preserve, interpret, translate, criticize, and transmit it. So, the consumption of knowledge, the utilization of knowledge is the survival of the knowledge. Libraries are not survival, books are not survival, but its usage and its utilization is actual survival. The book as an intellectual journey. The seven cities provide the geographical structure of the narrative of this book. The city of Alexandria, historical role in this book, has been depicted as ancient center of Greek scholarship. Alexandria has been remained the ancient center of Greek scholarship. Baghdad, Abbasi center of translation and scientific innovation. Cordoba, major center of Islamic Spain and intellectual exchange. Toledo, translation of bridge between Arabic and Latin intellectual worlds. Salerno, important medieval European center of medicine. Palermo or Sicily, a multicultural meeting point of Greek, Arabic, and Latin traditions. So that was the troika of these three civilizational context of knowledge, and that was Sicily, Venus, printing, dissemination, and Renaissance preservation. The geographical movement is important because it demonstrates that knowledge has a geography. Ideas flourish where there are libraries, scholars, money, political stability, educational institutions, manuscript networks, intellectual curiosity, and relative openness to different traditions. It means the discussion on different themes and disciplines and interaction between among the scholars and intellectuals of those disciplines. Alexandria, the beginning of the map. This book's map starts from Alexandria. The narrative begins with Alexandria, one of the great intellectual centers of antiquity. Alexandria symbolizes the concentration of libraries, scholars, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, and textual scholarship. The city provides the appropriate starting point because Euclid, who is now called in Oriental languages as Euclidus, and Ptolemy are closely associated with Alexandrian intellectual tradition, while Galen's intellectual formation also intersected with Alexandria. Critical significance. Moeller uses Alexandria not simply a geographical location but as a symbol of fundamental principle that civilization advances when knowledge is collected and made accessible to people capable of extending it. So civilization again is based on the knowledge and dissemination of the knowledge. This makes the library an important metaphor throughout the book. A library is not merely a warehouse of books, it is infrastructure of civilization. The fall of Rome and myth of lost knowledge. One of book's major historical transitions concern the decline of Roman world. Roman was a great empire of those days. The conventional narrative sometimes presents late antiquity and early Middle Ages as period in which classical knowledge disappeared into European Dark Age. Moeller complicates this picture. She demonstrates that knowledge was not simply destroyed and then miraculously rediscovered. Rather, it continued to exist in different intellectual environments. This is one of the book's strongest historiographical contributions. The real story is not ancient Greece, disappearance, Renaissance, but the real story is ancient Greece, Byzantine or Christian preservation, Islamic translation and scholarship, plus Jewish and Christian translations, European transmission, and Renaissance. The book therefore replaces the simplistic concept of intellectual loss with a much more complex history of continuity and transformation. Then comes Baghdad, the intellectual revolution. The discussion of Abbasid Baghdad is arguably the intellectual center of the book. In the 8th and 9th centuries, Baghdad became a major center for translation, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, geography, and scientific inquiry. Greek works were translated into Arabic, studied, commented upon, and developed further. The arrival of paper from China also facilitated the expansion of writing and scholarly activity. Critical appreciation, this is particularly important because Moeller rejects the idea that Islamic world merely stored Greek knowledge for later Europeans. Muslim scholars were not passive librarians. They were preservers, translators, critics, and innovators, and even inventors and discoverers. The distinction is fundamental. Preservation versus innovation. One of the most valuable ideas emerging from the book is the difference between preservation and innovation. Preservation is keeping an existing intellectual tradition alive, and innovation is using inherited knowledge to generate something new. The Islamic scholarly world did both. They preserved the knowledge and they innovated the new things, new formulas, new stories, and new history and new discoveries. Greek mathematics, astronomy, and medicine were translated and preserved, but scholars also corrected errors. They also developed mathematical methods, refined astronomical calculations. They expanded medical knowledge and produced original commentaries. The book, therefore, presents intellectual story as cumulative rather than merely reproductive. Knowledge is inherited, but every generation changes it. So that is common inheritance, and that common inheritance is being aided with some valuable information, and some information is being deleted from it. That is the process of change. Cordoba, the Western Islamic intellectual world. Moeller then moves towards Cordoba in Al-Andalus. Cordoba becomes a major center of scholarship, medicine, astronomy, philosophy, libraries, manuscript production, and cultural exchange. The city's importance illustrates the movement of knowledge within Islamic world itself. Thus, the intellectual transmission is not simply east-west. It is a network, Greek to Arabic to Islamic scholarly development, Iberia and Latin Europe. And the 700 years of Muslim rule in Spain, in Cordova, has given many wonderful and interesting books to the world. And in those days, there was Sheikh Muhyiddin ibn Arabi, the pioneer of the theory of oneness of existence, or the ideology of Wahdatul Wujud, and he has influenced Muslim world greatly, rather than any other person. Then Toledo, the translation bridge. Toledo becomes particularly important because it functions as a meeting point between Arabic and Latin-speaking intellectual cultures. After Christian conquest of Toledo in 1085, the city became a major site of translation of Arabic works into Latin. This process enabled European scholars to gain access to Greek philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and scientific works preserved and developed in Arabic. So the people of Muslim world and scholars of Muslim world can rightly be called as great bridge between the civilizations and between the two phases of the world in sphere of knowledge. One of the key figures is Gerard of Cremona, who traveled to Toledo in search of Ptolemy's Almagest and became one of great translators of Arabic scientific literature into Latin. Critical significance Toledo demonstrates that civilizations do not necessarily inherit knowledge directly. Sometimes knowledge must pass through a cultural intermediary. Translation is therefore not merely linguistic work, it is form of intellectual transmission. And in these days, are not in this present day world, there are hundreds of languages are interconvertible and they can be translated between them. And that is great achievement of a human experience. Translation as cultural transformation. This is perhaps one of the most profound concepts in the book. When a Greek word becomes Arabic and later Latin, it does not remain exactly the same as it is natural. Every translation involves interpretation, vocabulary choices, conceptual adaptation, commentary, clarification, and sometimes error. Therefore, translation is itself an act of scholarship. It is not merely a skill or craft. It itself is creativity. Muller demonstrates that movement of knowledge across languages created new intellectual possibilities. This makes the book particularly valuable for students of linguistics, literature, philosophy, history, Islamic studies, and translation studies. Salerno, medicine becomes institutionalized. Now, at this phase, the story then moves to Salerno, one of the medieval Europe's most important centers of medical learning. The medical traditions associated with Galen and Arabic scholarship contributed to the development of European medicine. Galen in Oriental world is called Jalinos. He was Hakim Jalinos. So this demonstrates another important point that knowledge needs institutions. A manuscript alone cannot transform society. It needs teachers, students, medical practitioners, schools, libraries, institutions, and networks of communication. Muller therefore moves beyond the history of books toward the history of intellectual ecosystems. Intellectual ecosystems. Sicily and Palermo, the multicultural laboratory. Now, from institutionalization of knowledge, we move forward to the multicultural laboratory of the knowledge. Palermo and the medieval Sicily occupy a particularly fascinating place in the book. Sicily brought together Greek traditions, it brought together Arabic culture, Latin Christianity, Norman political power, and Mediterranean commercial networks. The multicultural environment allowed translations and intellectuals exchanges to occur across religious and linguistic boundaries. This is social interaction between the societies, not only between the individuals. It was among the societies. Muller emphasizes Palermo as one of the places where scholars and work across cultural traditions. Critical interpretation. Sicily becomes an example of broader thesis. Intellectual creativity often emerges at cultural borders. Intellectual creativity often emerges at cultural borders. When different intellectual traditions encounter each other, they can generate new forms of knowledge. That is human interaction, social interaction, economic interaction, and then intellectual interaction. They generate the new flavors of the culture and intellect. Venus, from manuscript culture to print culture. The journey ends in Venus. Manuscript civilization to the print civilization. The printing press radically changed the scale and speed of intellectual transmission. And at this point, I would like to add that now again we are moving forward towards virtual world, and that is the in other uplifted journey of this intellectual journey of human being, human society. The printing press radically changed the scale and speed of intellectual transmission. Texts that previously existed in individual manuscripts, private libraries, monasteries, scholarly collections could now be produced in large numbers. This means that intellectual inheritance of Euclid, Ptolemy, and Galen became much more difficult to use. The three intellectual heroes of this book are Euclides. Euclid represents mathematical rationality. Mathematical rationality. His elements became foundational for geometry, for mathematical reasoning, for education, and later scientific thought. It was very much fundamental work. His presence in the book demonstrates how abstract mathematical knowledge can survive across radically different political and cultural environments. Ptolemy. Ptolemy represents, Ptolemy is also called in Oriental world Bathylemus. Ptolemy represents astronomical knowledge. The second thing, first thing was uh, mathematical rationality, then astronomical knowledge. First phase was measurement and measurement of the globe of the earth, and now the human being looked upon the heaven. That was astronomical knowledge. His Almagest became a major reference point of medieval Islamic and European astronomy. The importance of Ptolemy in Muller's narrative lies not only in his historical influence but also in the fact that later scholars could taste, correct, and extend his work. Then the third main hero is Galen, Hakim Jalinos. Galen represents medical knowledge. So mathematical rationality, astronomical knowledge, and then medical knowledge. His enormous body of medical writings influenced medicine for centuries. His legacy demonstrates both strength and limitation of inherited knowledge. Later physicians depended heavily on Galen, but they also discovered the same Galenic claims were incorrect. This gives the book an important philosophical lesson that preserving knowledge does not mean preserving every truth. Truth can be tested in the laboratory of time by different people, by different generations, and by different species. Then truth will be refined. Scientific progress requires both memory and criticism. The book's philosophy of knowledge. At its deepest level, the map of knowledge is not merely a history of books. It is philosophy of intellectual civilization that is interconnected throughout different civilizations. Muller's implicit argument can be summarized as knowledge survives through people. Knowledge survives through people, not through abstract civilizations. A manuscript survives because somebody copies it, somebody translates it, somebody pays for its preservation, somebody teaches it, somebody reads it, somebody argues with it, and somebody decides that it was worth transmitting or not. Therefore, intellectual history is ultimately also a history of human curiosity. So that is the point of author, that intellectual transmission is the history of human curiosity, and that is natural, not only of books. Knowledge as a network. The title, The Map of Knowledge, is especially appropriate. The book constructs an intellectual map whose roots connect Alexandria, Baghdad, Cordova, Toledo, Salerno, Palermo, and Venus. But these are not merely geographical routes. They are routes of manuscripts, people, languages, religions, scientific concepts, technologies, and institutions. Thus, the map is really a network of knowledge transmission. It is not just only map on a paperwork. A major strength decentering the Europe. One of the book's most valuable contribution is its challenge to a purely Eurocentric Renaissance narrative. A conventional story might say classical Greece to forgotten and during Middle Ages, as it was mentioned in the start, that lost knowledge or forgotten knowledge and rediscovered by Renaissance Europe. Moeller demonstrated a much more complicated trajectory. The Islamic world played a crucial role in preserving Greek texts, translating them, commenting upon them, developing them, and transmitting them into Latin Europe. A second major strength of this book is intellectual cosmopolitanism. Moeller repeatedly shows scholars crossing boundaries of language, religion, geography, and political identity. Greek texts could become Arabic texts and then Latin texts. Muslim scholars could study Greek philosophers. Christian scholars could learn from Arabic scientific literature. Jewish scholars could participate in translation networks. This suggests that history of knowledge is fundamentally cosmopolitan, not only in any of isolated niche. It is of nature of cosmopolitan. The book therefore provides an implicit critique of idea that civilizations develop entirely independently. It is not independently, they develop interdependently. Third strength of this book is making intellectual history accessible. Moeller writes for a general educated readership rather than exclusively for specialists. The narrative is built around journeys, cities, personalities, manuscripts, discoveries, and dramatic episodes. This makes a technically complicated subject accessible to the general reader, to the general educated person, not experts. The major achievement major achievement is intellectual history can easily reflect. Moeller gives it human drama. The role of the individual scholar. The book also reminds us that large historical transformations are often accomplished by relatively obscure individuals. Figures such as Gerard of Cremona become crucial because they physically and intellectually carried knowledge between cultures. This creates an important historical lesson. Civilization is not only by kings and conquerors, it is by intellectuals. And I would like to add into it that it is by the common people, by the masses, by the receiving end people. It is also made by translators, scribes, teachers, librarians, physicians, mathematicians, astronomers, printers, and students. Critical limitation, the Dark Ages framework. One area deserving criticism is terminology surrounding the European Middle Ages. The book's subtitle uses the language of classical ideas being lost and found, and some descriptions employ the conventional notion of the Dark Ages. The formulation can be problematic because it may inadvertently reinforce an outdated binary, ancient brilliance into medieval darkness, into Renaissance rebirth. Modern historians generally regard medieval Europe as much more complex. There was intellectual continuity, technological innovation, institutional development, religious scholarship, economic expansion, and considerable cultural production. Critical limitation. Second, the geography of knowledge. Although the book is impressively broad, its geographical map remains concentrated primarily around the Mediterranean, the Middle East, Islamic Spain, and Western Europe. This means other major intellectual civilizations receive less attention. So, this book is not a comprehensive book on the map of knowledge. It focuses on uh, an exclusive part of the globe. For example, one could ask that what was happening in India in those days? What was happening in subcontinent in those days? What was happening in China in those days? How did Sanskrit scientific traditions interact with Islamic scholarship? What about Persian, Indian, and Chinese mathematics? How did knowledge move through Central Asia? The book's map is therefore powerful but selective. Critical limitation, simplification for a general audience. Because Muller converts covers approximately 1,000 years in a relatively short book, complex intellectual debates sometimes have to be compressed. The book's treatment of Islamic civilization. The book is particularly valuable for correcting a misconception about the medieval Islamic world. Islamic civilization appears not simply as transmitter of ancient Greek knowledge, but as creative intellectual civilization. The sequence is better represented as Greek knowledge, Arabic translation, Islamic contemporary and criticism, commentary and criticism, new scientific developments, translation into Latin, European intellectual transformation. This is much more historically accurate than describing Muslim scholars merely preservers of the Greek civilization. Knowledge and religious pluralism. The book also illustrates a fascinating relationship between intellectual achievement and cultural pluralism. Several intellectual centers proposed because scholars of different backgrounds and could interact. The recurring conditions identified in the book include political stability, financial support, across access to texts, talented scholars, and openness to different nationalities and religions. This gives the book contemporary relevance. It suggests that intellectual civilization requires not merely brilliant individuals but social conditions that allow brilliance to flourish. Knowledge and political power. The book also demonstrates that knowledge is never completely independent of political structures. Scholarship depends and needs patronage, institutions, libraries, schools, courts, economic resources, and political stability. The relationship can therefore be represented as political stability, institutional support, scholarly activity, preservation of knowledge, and intellectual innovation. The manuscript as cultural artifact. Another important contribution is the attention to manuscripts. A manuscript is not merely a container of words. It is evidence of who valued knowledge, who copied it, where it traveled, which language was preferred, who could afford books, and which texts were considered worth preserving. Thus, the physical history of book becomes a form of cultural history. The printing press as an epistemic revolution. Venus represents more than a final destination of the narrative. Before printing, one manuscript, limited readership. After printing, many copies and a large relationship faster circulation, standardization, criticism, cumulative scholarship. The strengths of this book are: it is very much good book to be read. Thank you very much. You have watched my video. Thank you.